Why isn't this church more famous? Coming up on Architecture Codex.
Architecture Codex. If you want to see more, subscribe.
I was in San Francisco doing pilgrimage to a number of different significant works of architecture one Saturday evening, and I knew I wanted to get to church. Being Catholic, I have a serious obligation to attend Mass each Sunday. And for my family, that has never really been a burden. I mean, there are so many Catholic churches, so many different Masses to choose from, including Saturday evening vigils. So when we travel, we find local churches and go to Mass. I had just visited the Seven Sisters, Architecture Codex video number 85, in the Alamo Square section of the city, and GPS told me that there was a church nearby, and I headed over there. Soon I could see the church from a distance, with a dominating presence on one of the hills. Wow, that's interesting, I thought. When I got to the church, I was amazed and impressed, and wondered why this church never came to my knowledge previously. This is the Cathedral of St. Mary of the Assumption, and it was built in 1971. It was astounding, powerful, and transcendent. Fans of Architecture Codex know about my theory about what makes transcendent space: light, loft, and craft, and certainly at this church, the dominant aspect is loft. The concrete shell stands on massive shoes and lifts high into the sky, some 200 feet, with the form of the concrete curving in and up. Geometrically, 8 hyperbolic paraboloids linked together with 4 quadrants separated by stained glass, allowing the shells to appear to float. Like our favorite Pantheon, the inner shell is articulated with concrete coffers, here as triangles, which is more appropriate when in computer modeling we might call them polygonal meshes or faces. And while you feel the heaviness above you, you also feel its power, very much like how you feel under a stone Gothic vault or a Byzantine dome. Yes, the church manipulates light and provides craft as well, but in each case they help emphasize the loft that reaches upwards towards the heavens. Only later did I discover that this design was influenced by one of my favorite architects, Luigi Nervi. Nervi is one of my favorites because I think he was the last true master builder, that is, the architect and the contractor, which used to be the same thing until about 200 years ago. I do a deep dive into Nervi's famous Italian buildings in Architecture Codex video number 52. However, it's much more complicated than saying Nervi was one of the designers of this church in San Francisco. Perhaps I did not know about this church because the design is not beloved. Apparently, many San Franciscans are ashamed of this church. There were many design controversies, apparently, at least in the eyes of the architecture press, and that seemed to have tarnished its reputation. This kind of reinforces my belief that those who can't design criticize. The original cathedral was built in 1854, but they soon outgrew that and built another one in the latter part of the 19th century. That suffered a devastating fire in 1962. And so the Archdiocese went about planning for a new cathedral. During the time of Vatican II, Archbishop McGuckin announced there would be a new cathedral and it needed to achieve 3 things. 1, the cathedral should accommodate a large number of people. 2, it should be designed in such a way that this large community would feel closely connected to Eucharistic celebration at the altar. 3, the building should proclaim the presence of a living Christian community worshiping in the midst of the modern city. In 1963, when the Archdiocesan Office announced that the architects would be a joint venture, a team including Angus McSweeney, Paul Ryan, and John Lee, the reaction in the press was, "Who?" Right there you see that there's a prejudice, assuming that famous architects means good architects. While McSweeney Ryan and Lee's record on the internet is sparse, the team consisted of architects who had done a lot of work for the San Francisco and Oakland dioceses during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, including churches, schools, and convents. This was a time of expansive building by the diocese of the Catholic Church in America, and frequently a single architecture firm might emerge as the bishop's favorite in any given diocese. In New York, it was Edgar's and Higgins. And if Ryan and Lee with McSweeney through the years were similar to Edgar's and Higgins, they were competent and prolific. I have done many renovations on buildings designed by Edgar's and Higgins using their original plans, and subsequently, I feel like I know them. As the architects doing a lot of work in the diocese for many decades, it made sense for the archdiocese to award them the project for their most important commission to date, a new cathedral. And I cannot find any record of that first design, but I did find that it was universally derided. Best I can tell is it was traditional, being a Romanesque-style church with a little bit of Spanish mission thrown in. And one critic said it looks like what happens when a camel mates with a donkey. I suspect this is all unfair, and while the design might have been traditional, it might very well have been excellent. Perhaps the traditional design was also a way to conserve on the budget, as not-so-famous architects are generally not used to bankrupting their clients. I am not sure why pompous people in the press had so much influence over the proposed design. But soon enough, the Archbishop added Pietro Belluschi to the team and added the instruction to come up with something more modern. Belluschi brought in Nervi. Ryan, Lee, and McSweeney remained as the architects of record, participating with Belluschi and Nervi to execute the final design. I will talk about style for a moment. Too many architects are locked into the style that they do. If you do only traditional architecture, your attitude would be the church should be traditional. And if you're a modernist, you might argue that it should be modern. They say if all you have is a hammer, the entire world looks like a nail. To me, the choice of traditional or modern evolves from the project, the site, the program, and the budget. I can do modern churches, I can do traditional churches. But if you want a stone Gothic church, you will need a lot more money, and you might have to wait 200 years for it to be finished. Belluschi, an Italian immigrant, had been the Dean of Architecture at MIT and had an extensive portfolio of churches and other building types in Oregon, where he based his practice. He developed a national presence which allowed him to consult on many significant architecture projects, including New York City's Juilliard School, Alice Tully Hall, and working with Walter Gropius on the Pan Am building over Grand Central, now MetLife. Belluschi engaged Pietro Luigi Nervi to assist him, as he wanted to make sure that any design was able to withstand the famous San Francisco earthquakes. They tested scale models of the emerging form, ranging from 1 to 100 scale to 1 to 1/15th scale, for earthquake resistance and modify the design to improve its performance. When they announced the final scheme in 1964, Nervi said that it was, quote, the first cathedral truly of our time and in harmony with the liturgical reforms of the council, end quote. That right there might be the source of your controversy. The building certainly achieved the objectives laid out by the Archbishop. One of the purposes of the new order of the Mass was to bring more involvement into the church by the laity. You had lay lectors, you had extraordinary Eucharistic ministers, and they eliminated the altar rail, which once separated the people from the priest and the altar. Prior to that, the Mass had evolved over the centuries from an intimate affair inside a home with everyone gathered around a table to a little bit of a show where the priest faced away from the people, spoke in a language that most people didn't understand, and, as I said, were separated from what was going on, to the point where many people in church simply said their rosary or said their own prayers independent of the action of the Mass. Long churches were once necessary because of the limitations of building technology being only able to make spaces so wide, but that could put some people within the Mass hundreds of feet away from the altar. We can discuss the new order of the Mass some other time. It shouldn't be controversial, but apparently for some people it is. Belluschi's design discarded the longitudinal Latin cross plan and centralized the space, more like a Greek domed church, with a base 225-foot square. Here, though, the dome was kind of inverted or hollowed out, with the ceiling coming in before it went up. And because of the plan, none of the 2,400 people who might attend a Mass were more than 75 feet away from the altar, ambo, and the presider's chair. While the announcement of Belluschi and Nervi being added to the design team initially calmed the critics, that did not save the building itself from severe criticism. There were those who thought the form was too cold, too devoid of art and tradition, and there was the usual complaint that the money could have been spent on the poor. Apparently the protests were so volatile, the church was dedicated in a quiet closed ceremony. But the primary complaint was that the Belluschi church was too similar to St. Mary's Cathedral in Tokyo, designed by Kenzo Tange and built in 1964. This is an interesting issue. First, if they had gone traditional, the goal then would have been to copy some previously designed church. No one complains that the Amiens Cathedral is just too similar to Notre Dame de Paris. On the other hand, when it comes to modern churches, the critics are always looking for something new, something completely different that will revolutionize architecture, and that simply is unrealistic. I have no inside information, but it is probably a safe bet to say that Belluschi was aware of the church being built in Tokyo. Is St. Mary's in San Francisco similar to St. Mary's in Tokyo? Yes. Is it a ripoff? No. When I see a great building, I might be inspired by one aspect of it and maybe perhaps try that on one of my projects. This is not called ripping off. This is called learning. What I bring to that idea and how I twist it or change it is where my personal creativity comes in. Remember, in the early days, the Beatles were trying to sound like Buddy Holly. I suspect that at most, the shell structure of the Tokyo church was intriguing and may have spawned an idea. Shell structures were being experimented with during this time. We examined Paul Williams' La Concha Motel in Architecture Codex video number 86, which predated both buildings as it opened in 1961. Both churches use the same structure, the hyperbolic paraboloid, but their shells are upside down when compared with Williams. And if you are dealing with a structural system like thin concrete shells, physics will drive you to similar form. And if you accept that the structures would be similar, you can also see there are obviously different design choices that were made. Unfortunately, I have to do this analysis not having visited the church in Tokyo. The San Francisco church has a central Greek plan. The Tokyo church has a Latin cross plan with a long nave. In San Francisco, the top ridge of the shells are flat. In Tokyo, they curve up and outward. The San Francisco church is rendered in concrete and travertine. The Tokyo church is rendered in concrete with a stainless steel finish. The San Francisco church has almost no traditional architectural references. The Tokyo church implies traditional Japanese temple references at its entrance. The San Francisco church has its cross at the center of the adjoining forms. The Tokyo church has a separate tower where the cross sits. One thing both churches share is disdain from the critics. Regardless of the critics, I like the church in San Francisco, and the church in Tokyo is now on my must-see list. I suspect when I get there, I will like that church as well. The church in San Francisco is unfortunately and accidentally the butt of jokes because of how the shadows are cast on the form as the day progresses. I am reluctant to note this, like I'm some sort of middle school boy fascinated with female genitalia, but it is part of the legacy. I suspect all this bad press has kept San Franciscans from bragging about the church, and that is why I never heard of it until I was walking to it to go to Mass. It even took the local AIA until 2007 before they recognized the cathedral as one of San Francisco's top 25 buildings. In spite of the complex history or the controversies, For me, architecture comes down to the same thing. What does the building look like, and how is it to experience it? It doesn't matter how famous the architect was or how complicated or expensive the design-build process was, and it doesn't even matter what no-talent critics say about the building. What matters is what happens to you as a person when you experience the space. What emotions do you feel? What parts of your brain are stimulated? Do you get the message that the builders were trying to send? And in that regard, St. Mary's of the Assumption Cathedral in San Francisco is an absolute success. I'm Michael Molinelli, and this is Architecture Codex.